we have Roger Barranco from Akamai. Roger is the VP of Global Security Operations. Thanks for joining us. He was previously the VP of Service Delivery at Prolexic prior to the Akamai acquisition. And before that, he was the CTO and VP of Operations for Host.net. We're really excited to hear about some of the experiences that you've had over the last few months in terms of security. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks very much for this opportunity. I'm very passionate about this topic, but I'll talk fast at times intentionally so that we have time, hopefully, for questions and can get back on track. Next slide, please. Okay, so the items that I'm going to talk a little bit about today is SOCC and NOC interoperation. Going to also share some threat research snippets, talk about different attacks that we've seen, and I really want to spend a little bit more time on what you can do to better position yourself to protect yourself from that day that, if you haven't experienced it yet, probably will come when you become a target of a malicious cyber actor out there. And then, like I said before, we'll have some Q&A time after that. Next, please. So when we talk about the SOC and the structure of the SOC, there's a lot of different layers in the team. Our security team is quite large. If you bring that down to just the people that focus on triage and actual detection mitigation type efforts, it's around 200 people globally. We have 6 SOCs positioned around the world. We do that for the purpose of trying to get as close to our customers as possible. We don't have a follow the sun model with the exception of Japanese support. And we want to create personal relationships as best possible with our customers when there's a security event that they can need a little assistance with. So that front line is the triager. So they are highly available. As soon as that phone call comes in or that alert comes in, they follow a very strict run book that's negotiated in advance with the customer on what the customer's expectations are for engagement. So we have tight processes around that that says, hey, you know, for this type of alert, it's not that important to me. You can just email me. Or for this type of alert or scenario, please get me on the phone or page me or whatever that contact method happens to be. Some customers in certain situations will say, you know what, I trust you all, just mitigate that attack, do what you need to do. You don't have to proactively engage us. It's according to whatever that customer's change control expectations are along the way. But that front line of triagers gets a lot of information, just like I'm sure many people on the call also get a lot of information flowing their way from an alerting perspective. And they'll go through and categorize, and they're sitting physically near security specialists and networking specialists. And they'll, in parallel, engage the right resources to jump on the problem with them and communicating with the customer. A huge piece of it is just the monitoring aspect of it. When we talk about false positive rates and true positive rates, our goal is to only engage the customer on true positives, things that are actionable and relevant to the customer. Now, the reality is, because we're looking at a lot of network related events also, there's a huge amount of what I would call a false positive, right? So like the previous gentleman shared with us about looking at those anomalies. So 24/7, someone's looking at that, they see a little spike, they're going to look at that and dig in very hard to make sure that the network is performing well, that traffic can reach us, be processed, and subsequently handed off well. And from a security perspective, let's investigate that spike or change in traffic to see if there's any malicious traffic inserted or mixed in with that. To do that, you have to have a proper mix of automation, because not everything needs to be done by a human being. Certainly, I love automation, and certainly will always have that as a part of the solution. But there are times where you need that highly available human being to go in and look at that particular situation and communicate it back. Now, where it becomes super important is the involvement with the networking team. And a lot of people think of the SOC and they think, oh, it's just security. But you have to have a lot of different skill sets in there if you're going to have a well-rounded service experience. So we'll go over to one of our network engineers who are typically CCNP, CCIE level people, just so you have a feel for the skill level, because it's not only routing, switching in an infrastructure, they're worried about routing, switching on a global scale involving the internet, not only from a DNS perspective, but also from a BGP perspective. And it's not unusual during a very large attack that maybe 60% of the resources are security leaning. The other 40% are network leaning, because we are looking for possible exhaustion points on the internet that need to be routed around. So we will avoid and manipulate the internet, basically, on how we want to absorb that traffic. And that's a fair amount of magic that goes on. There's a lot of resiliency from BGP and other tools that can be used that will automate a lot of that activity, but sometimes you have to work around different problem areas. One simple example is during COVID in the New York area, there were two major ISPs that had a peering link between them. And with that peering link, because more people were working from home, it was always saturated. So to make sure that our end user customers had the right experience, right, even though it's not technically our problem, we will manipulate the way we take in our traffic through traffic shaping to end up giving the customer the best experience possible. Next slide, please. So this is where, the ThousandEyes tool has been a tremendous help for us. One of the things that we struggled with a couple years ago was when the customer would say, hey, you're in front of us, this is your issue to figure out. And they're not wrong with that perception, but we want to partner with them in trying to solve those types of issues. The ThousandEyes product has been a huge help in us being able to identify where a problem may be and route around it. In particular, we use heavily the Internet Insights module that ThousandEyes has. And that tool has saved us a massive amount of labor and really helped us with our communications with our customers, because a lot of our customers obviously have this product also, and we can compare information from that third-party source. So it's been very valuable in helping us answer that question when it's tempting to say, hey, it's not us, right? We can prove it much better with that tool, in addition to the obvious monitoring endpoint services that are built into it. Next slide, please. So when we talk about scale and attacks, I wanted to just throw some numbers out. And these numbers are absolutely massive and really hard to consume. But at a high level, in just one day, the platform handled over 12 million SQL injection attacks. If we look at bot attacks, the bot attacks, there were over 14 million bot attacks in one day. The platform handles that. There's a lot of automation in there to make sure things go well with that type of activity. But to do that, you have to have massive scale. And when we talk about the threats, that some of which are listed here on the screen from a WAF perspective, the one that really concerns me and is a massive amount of labor to address is credential stuffing. So in one day, there were 151 million. This is not a peak. This is just one day. We just pulled some numbers. 151 million credential stuffing attacks made. So that's a real incentive to rotate your passwords or passphrases, whichever you prefer to use, on a regular basis, because I guarantee you that a large number of you probably have your passwords unfortunately exposed out there somewhere, and someone is taking them, knowing that we all saw what's in the news recently about Twitter, and hoping that you're using the same password in Twitter that you're using on your bank account possibly. So, keep them diverse and spread out. But when we talk about scale, the platform has nearly 300,000 endpoints around the world, over 150 different countries, that we're in and taking in information, because we want to be as close to the attack as possible, and we want to be as close to your end customer as possible to be able to serve their content properly or protect them as best possible. So on an average day, it's not unusual to see over 100 terabits of good traffic, and that's good traffic that's HTTP, HTTPS, so surfing oriented traffic. The number goes way higher than the 100 terabit number I just shared with you. If there's a big sporting event that's being served, or there's a big software download that's going on at the time. So you have to have that combination of massive platform capacity mixed with the right level of automation and mixed with the right level of immediately available human assistance when there are questions or when there are attacks that need to be mitigated. Because at the end of the day, if we talk about DDoS, which is a simpler form of cyber attack as compared to a WAF attack, or certainly as compared to a credential stuffing attack, anybody can stop it. That's pretty easy. But stopping it while simultaneously allowing clean traffic to go through, that's where the magic happens along the way. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the types of attacks over time, and if we're focusing on WAF, it's very different. And I'll put two chunks of information up here. And I'm noting that globally, remote file inclusion is the #1 type of WAF or website type of attack out there. And in EMEA, it's SQL injection. So what we found out is that most attackers are actually close to the victim. They're in the same country, they have a relationship with them, it's usually tighter. Now there's an exception for that when it's nation state driven, which is a tough actor to fight, obviously, if it's a government, or it's direct criminal activity, right? Not someone trying to just do a simple scam with that. But it shows that attacks are very different in how they are leveraged according to where you are in the world. Why is that? Because there are different attitudes on how to protect your infrastructure that's different around the world also. So for example, when we see a threat come out and patching is required, for example, in a customer's infrastructure, our customers that are in the Japan region are very fast, very efficient at knocking those items down. And we can see the threats that are associated with those risks drop off very quickly. Next slide, please. So if we talk, moving forward, just talking about DDoS and not about the WAF types of attacks, this graph, if you look to the right, we see the upswing. That's an upswing in attacks that were over 100 gig in size, right? So this year has been exceptionally busy and different from a large attack perspective. Now, the overall number of attacks, that's always been increasing, but it hasn't been increasing at the same rate as IoT, Internet of Things, that are available out there to be compromised until recently. So it looks very much like a lot of threat actors out there are leveraging or realizing now that, hey, I can make money by selling access to my tool that will launch a DDoS. In the past, the DDoS was directly aimed at the entity they were attacking to try to say, hey, let's go ahead and get money, Bitcoin from them. I'm going to attack you again if you don't give me Bitcoin, right? We haven't seen as much of that with DDoS. It seems to have really swung over to political, social statement, those types of activities where entity A wants to cause harm to entity B. But next slide, please. So this is a snippet of DDoS across this year. Now, if we look at that far upper right attack, that was 1.44 terabits in size. Absolutely massive from a bits per second attack. Not the world's largest. The world's largest that I'm aware of that's been publicized was 2.3 terabits, shared it with AWS, and I'll get into a little more detail on that shortly. But when you look at the lower right side, that gray, that in my mind, even though it's not high on the scale, that's actually the largest, most malicious DDoS, because that was 809 million packets per second, an attack that we handled. And the rest of it that's a mix of the different verticals and attacks that you can see. Now, I don't want to gloss over this, because that bottom line, there are obviously this year hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of DDoS that were handled. But if you look at that scale, you can see that the vast majority of those were well above the 10 gig range. And I don't know how many enterprises out there have an available 10 gig pipe, right? So as soon as that gets any bigger than whatever that pipe to the internet is that you have, then that's a problem. And from a packet per second, you don't even need to have a large attack from a bandwidth perspective, and that's designed to knock your gear over. Next slide, please. These are the attacks I wanted to highlight. The AWS one, 2.3 terabits, was 293 million packets per second. Both are huge numbers, but the packet per second pales a little bit. Now, that particular attack was a CLDAP reflection in mass. So that is taking advantage of the amplification you can get by querying a server and having that server reply with a lot more bandwidth than the original request. So you can redirect those attacks at a victim. With the Akamai 1.44 terabits, it had an even larger packet per second attack mixed in with that. But that had 9 different vectors. So that attacker was super vigilant and really wanted to cause some damage out there. And that's actually a reasonably hard attack to handle, because you have to understand what are all the vectors that are being aimed at the customer and what are the customer's expectation of that type of traffic, and how do I clean that up. Then the other one was the 809. That was UDP in mass. That was UDP being aimed at 80. And then there's Cloudflare had a 250 gig, but very large, 754 million packet per second attack. And that was 2 vectors. So some absolute prize-winning attacks have happened this year on the DDoS front. Next slide, please. So I wanted to very quickly, just to stay on track, and share some threat research snippets that I got recently from InfoSec. And the command and controls that are out there to launch those attacks, they're not really contested. They've done a good job of building them so that when you say, hey, I feel like renting 5 minutes of time at this much attack size, what do I need to do? They queue that up and they'll manage it. The problem is that there's infighting for the bots that are out there, what the items are that command and control is leveraging. So it's not unusual to have an attacker gain control, let's say, of an enterprise DVR out there, and another attacker gains control of it. They will actually remove the code of the original attacker so that they can maintain 100% control of that device. Because that device, it's not unusual, for example, an enterprise level DVR, to be able to put out 500, half a gig of traffic. That's becoming a problem for some ISPs, where people always think about, oh, I'm the victim, I'm being hit by DDoS. For some ISPs, it's a problem for sending the data, right? So if you all of a sudden have your pipe being filled on the outbound for a customer, that's a problem to be able to clean up. The thing, again, to speed things up, to stay on track here, that the IoT devices out there, if they've been out there for a while and you think, hey, I want to secure them now, it's probably too late. They're probably already compromised. So the best thing to do, unfortunately, is reset them back to factory, patch them up, update the security around that, whether that is better passwording and firewalling, and then put it back onto the internet. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide, please. So what can you do? Number one is know your traffic. The number of times that I've been on the phone with the customer, I say, hey, how much of this traffic do you expect? It's not unusual for a customer to have no idea. They don't know their profiling. So Take the time to understand your traffic, because if you don't understand your traffic, you're not going to know how to defend yourself. Build your defensive posture in advance during peacetime. There's nothing worse than being in the war, you're under attack, and you have to spend a gob of time figuring out what is the right level of mitigation that I need at that particular time. Come up with a plan B defensive posture. If there's a really horrific attack hitting you, understand what are my core services, HTTP, DNS, and I don't care about VPN and everything else in my network, and I don't care about traffic out of this country, but I do care about it out of that country. How can you set up a defensive posture that's just get me back online? So have a plan A and have a plan B. Tie in your business continuity plan and your ERP, your emergency response plan, to your testing. I know it's horribly boring, but do your cyber hygiene, which is the patching, the proper passwords, the proper firewalling, and knowing your environment. Implement the right balance of automation and human. There's an architecture called Zero Trust that I'm a huge believer in. It's hard to transition to Zero Trust if you have a legacy network, but if you're building a new network, we don't have today enough time to get into it, but seriously consider a Zero Trust environment when you come up with that new architecture. Work with your upstream providers, many of which have been talking today about building that environment. And seriously, you have to test, and retest when you build something, because if you haven't tested your business continuity plan or you haven't tested your defensive posture, it's going to fail in a bad way. So you have to do that on a regular basis. Next slide, please. All right, so hopefully I left a little time for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Roger. That was a great session. A lot of really, really good data in there, kind of showing how not just, the network, the internet's doing with COVID, but what the impact has been from, a threat level perspective. So we did have a couple of questions come in. So
Sure.
Thanks for leaving that extra time. So the first one is around, given the reported traffic increases in the wake of the lockdowns, COVID, were there any instance where normal traffic was confused with a DDoS attack?
No, there wasn't, because from the origin or from the customer perspective, we know the type of traffic, and we don't generally trigger off of volume, right? So that can be very ugly if you set thresholds that say, hey, anything over a gig, start chopping off that traffic. That's going to unintentionally eat good traffic. So while we did see variations, it did not have a subsequent impact on DDoS, or the mitigation. Where we did see problems is where we had to manage the internet itself away from the customer and away from our environment to route around problem areas.
Interesting. All right. The second question is, specific to, certain type of services that might have been targeted more than others, especially around, right now, VPNs basically are super critical for, productivity, experience, and all of that, because all of us are working from home. Was there any specific service that was targeted more in this time frame than previous pre-COVID?
Yeah. So where we saw the greatest level of increase was actually a little different. It was more infrastructure oriented, and it was on malware and direct phishing attempts to get people to click on something in their email openings, knowing that people are home, and home is frequently, unless you have a zero trust environment, a weaker security environment than in the office. That's been the big spike. There's been a spike in credential stuffing. If you would ask me this question towards the beginning of this year to pontificate on where we were going with it, I would have said SIP is going to be attacked and VPN is going to be attacked.
Right.
A little, very slight increase in activity on that front, but not anywhere near what I would have incorrectly assumed would have been a vulnerability in this new world.
Right. Okay. With respect to those phishing attacks, just me asking a follow-on is, how much of the type of message or the type of attack could you recognize? Was it, trying to accelerate and kind of piggyback on the criticality of COVID, or was it, similar to pre-COVID?
It was more targeted. So it would say, because of COVID, and it would look like an email from your employer or from your bank, right? It would say, because of COVID, please click here and assure your credentials. That's a simple example, obviously.
Right, sure, fair.
But yeah, the verbiage of the attack was absolutely changed. The methodology or the final exploit was not changed.
Got it. Okay, that's useful to know. Kind of, I would expect them to do that, right? Like take advantage of the situation.
Right.
Yep. Well, Roger, thank you so much for the session. This was really great. If there are any more questions that come in, we'll kind of use them at the end of the show.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.
All right.